in the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind lace curtains and every neighbour knows more than they let on, a single missing file can unravel a web of greed, betrayal, and long-buried truths. When a vital legal document vanishes overnight from a locked solicitor's office, the village buzzes with speculation. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye for human nature and knack for spotting what others overlook, can untangle the mystery. Set in the charming yet deceptive 1950s English countryside, this tale promises clever twists, sharp dialogue, and a resolution that will leave you stunned. Chapter 1. The Tranquil Morning in St. Mary Mead. The sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow on the thatched cottages and dew-kissed roses that lined the high street. It was the kind of morning that promised nothing more eventful than the clink of teacups at the vicarage or the rustle of Mrs. Price's grocery deliveries. In her modest cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she gazed at the world beyond her garden gate. To the untrained eye, she was merely a white-haired spinster, her spectacles perched on her nose, her hands busy with wool. But those who knew her understood that Miss Marple's gentle demeanour hid a mind sharper than any detective's at Scotland Yard. The village was stirring. The milkman's cart rattled past, and young Tommy Pierce darted across the lane, no doubt up to some harmless mischief. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a smile. "Boys will be boys," she murmured, her thoughts drifting to her nephew Raymond and his latest literary escapades in London. She adjusted her shawl and returned to her knitting, but her eyes never left the street. She had a habit of noticing things, small things, like the way Mrs. Clement's curtains twitched when the postman lingered too long, or how Mr. Hargreaves, the solicitor, had seemed unusually preoccupied of late. Mr. Hargreaves' office, a neat Georgian building at the end of the high street, was the heart of St. Mary Mead's legal affairs. Wills, deeds, and property disputes all passed through his meticulous hands. He was a man of routine, arriving at precisely 9 each morning, his bowler hat gleaming, his briefcase clutched tightly. So, when Miss Marple noticed his office door still shut at 10:30, her curiosity stirred. "Most unlike him," she said to herself, setting her knitting aside. She glanced at her clock, its ticking a steady companion in the quiet room. Perhaps he's taken ill. But something in her gut, a sense honed by years of observing human nature, told her otherwise. As if on cue, a commotion erupted outside. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and peered through the lace curtains. A small crowd had gathered near the solicitor's office. There was Constable Higgins, his notebook flapping in the breeze, and Mrs. Price, her arms crossed, and her voice carrying snippets of indignation. "Locked tight, it was," she heard someone say. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Trouble, it seemed, had come to St. Mary Mead. She stepped into her garden, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, and made her way toward the gathering. By the time she arrived, Mr. Hargreaves himself had appeared, his face pale and his usual composure frayed. "It's gone," he was saying, his voice high with disbelief. "The file, Miss Winthrop's file. It's vanished from my desk overnight." The crowd murmured. Miss Winthrop, the reclusive heiress of Willow Grange, had died only a month ago, leaving behind a fortune and a tangle of relatives eager for their share. Her will, it was rumoured, held secrets that could shake the village's genteel facade. Miss Marple lingered at the edge of the group, her head tilted as if merely curious, but her mind was already cataloguing details: the locked door, the unbroken windows, the faint smudge of mud on the office doorstep. "Dear me," she said softly, catching Constable Higgins' eye. "A file, you say? How very puzzling." Higgins tipped his helmet. "Morning, Miss Marple. A right mystery. This is. No sign of a break-in, but that file set's nowhere to be found. Mr. Hargreaves swears he locked it in his desk last night." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. "And who else has a key to the office?" Hargreaves hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with his tie. "Only my clerk, young Peter Ellis, but he's been with me for years, trustworthy as they come." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. She thought of Peter Ellis, a quiet young man with a nervous habit of tugging at his cuffs. Trustworthy, perhaps, but people were rarely what they seemed. She glanced at the crowd. Mrs. Price, still clucking like a hen, Dr. Haydock looking grave, and a stranger, a tall man in a grey coat, watching from across the street. His presence felt out of place. As the constable shooed the onlookers away, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze settling on the office door. A missing file, a locked room, and a village full of secrets. It was, she decided, precisely the sort of puzzle she enjoyed. "Perhaps I'll take tea at the vicarage this afternoon," she murmured, already planning her next steps. The vicarage was where tongues wagged, and Miss Marple knew that a single careless word could unravel even the cleverest of schemes. The mystery has begun, and St. Mary Mead is buzzing with secrets. Where are you reading this cozy tale from? Your own quiet village, a bustling city, or somewhere else entirely? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next chapter of Miss Marple's adventure. What do you think happened to the missing file? Share your theories below. And stay tuned for Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Solicitor's Urgent Summons. The high street of St. Mary Mead had settled back into its usual rhythm by noon, but the air carried a faint undercurrent of unease. Miss Marple, her basket hooked over one arm, made her way toward Mr. Hargreaves' office, her steps measured but purposeful. She had no intention of intruding. Oh no, that would never do, but a polite inquiry about the morning's excitement seemed only neighbourly. The solicitor's office was a sturdy affair, its red brick facade softened by ivy that clung to the walls. The sign above the door read Hargreaves and Son Solicitors, though the son had long since moved to London, leaving Mr. Hargreaves to manage alone. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the blinds were half drawn, a sign of disarray in a man who prided himself on order. She knocked lightly, and the door opened almost at once. Mr. Hargreaves stood there, his face still pale, his tie slightly askew. "Miss Marple," he said, managing a weak smile, "how kind of you to call. I'm afraid it's a rather trying day." "Dear me, Mr. Hargreaves," she replied, her voice all concern. "I couldn't help overhearing the commotion earlier. A missing file, was it? How dreadful." He ushered her inside, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting eavesdroppers. The office was as neat as ever, with rows of leather-bound ledgers lining the shelves and a heavy oak desk dominating the room. But the atmosphere felt charged, like the moment before a storm. Constable Higgins was there, scribbling in his notebook, while Peter Ellis, the young clerk, hovered near a filing cabinet, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "It's the Winthrop file," Hargreaves said, sinking into his chair. Miss Winthrop's will, her estate papers, everything, gone from my desk, though I locked it myself last night. The door was locked, the windows secure. It says impossible, Miss Marple. Impossible things do happen, she said mildly, her eyes drifting to the desk. It was a solid piece with a brass lock on the central drawer. No scratches, no signs of tampering. And you said certain no one else could have entered. Certain, Hargreaves said, though his voice wavered. Peter was the last to leave yesterday, and he swears he locked up as usual. Peter Ellis, a lanky young man, with a perpetually anxious air, nodded vigorously. I did, sir. Checked the windows too. Everything was in order when I left at 6. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Peter. His cuffs were frayed, she noticed, and he tugged at them nervously. And you saw nothing unusual, Mr. Ellis? She asked, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. Nothing, miss, he stammered. I went straight home to my lodgings. Mrs. Baxter, my landlady, can vouch for me. Constable Higgins cleared his throat. We risked looking into it, Miss Marple. Might be an outsider, someone passing through. There was that stranger in the grey coat, seen about this morning. Oh yes, Miss Marple said, her eyes brightening. I noticed him myself. Rather tall, wasn't steady, standing across the street. Hargreaves frowned. A stranger. I didn't see anyone, but then I was so flustered. His voice trailed off, and he rubbed his temples. That file, Miss Marple, it's vital. Miss Winthrop's estate is worth thousands, and her will, well, it's a delicate matter. There are those who won't be pleased with its contents. Family disputes are so often troublesome, Miss Marple said, almost to herself. She thought of the Winthrop family, old Miss Winthrop, who had lived like a recluse at Willow Grange, her nephew Gerald Winthrop, a charming but feckless man who frequented the Blue Boar, and his cousin Clara Winthrop, a sharp-tongued woman who had nursed her aunt in her final days. Hargreaves nodded glumly. The will names beneficiaries, but there are complications. I can say more, not yet, but if that file isn't found, there'll be chaos. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her mind already turning. Perhaps it starts not gone far, she said. Things have a way of turning up in the most unexpected places. As she stepped back into the sunlight, she paused by the doorstep, her eyes catching a faint glint in the gravel. She bent down, her movement slow and deliberate, and picked up a tiny object, a sliver of glass, no bigger than a thumbnail. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her expression unreadable. Curious, she murmured, glancing back at the office, the locked door, the missing file, the stranger in the grey coat. It was all beginning to feel like one of her jigsaw puzzles, with pieces that didn't yet fit, but they would in time. They always did. Chapter 3. Whispers at the Vicarage Tea. The vicarage garden was a picture of pastoral charm, with its neatly trimmed hedges and a table set for tea under the shade of an ancient yew tree. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, presided over the gathering with her usual flustered hospitality, her cheeks pink from the effort of keeping teacups filled and conversation flowing. The guests, St. Mary Mead's usual assortment of gossips and busybodies, chattered over scones and cucumber sandwiches, but the topic on everyone's lips was the missing file. Miss Marple sat quietly in a wicker chair, her knitting in her lap, her eyes moving from face to face. She had a way of blending into such gatherings, her presence as unremarkable as the china teapot, yet nothing escaped her notice. Mrs. Price, the grocer's wife, was holding court, her voice carrying over the clink of teaspoons. "It's theft. Plain and simple," Mrs. Price declared, her double chin quivering with indignation. "That file didn't walk off on its own. Someone got designs on Miss Winthrop's fortune, mark my words." "Really, Mrs. Price," said Dr. Haydock, stirring his tea with a sceptical air, "it's a bit early for such conclusions. The police are still investigating." "Police?" Mrs. Price snorted. "Constable Higgins couldn't find his own hat if it wasn't on his head. No, it's an inside job. I wager. That Peter Ellis, always looking shifty. I saw him loitering by the post office last week, muttering to himself." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Peter Ellis again. His nervous manner was certainly drawing attention, though she suspected it was more a matter of temperament than guilt. She glanced at Clara Winthrop, who sat apart, her thin lips pressed into a line. Clara, with her severe black dress and sharp eyes, had been Miss Winthrop's companion in her final years. She was not a woman given to idle chatter, but today she seemed particularly guarded. "Miss Winthrop," Miss Marple said gently, leaning toward her, "you must be dreadfully upset about this business with your Aunt Set's file." Clara Sit's teacup paused midway to her lips. It's inconvenient," she said curtly. "Aunt Eleanor Sit's affairs were complicated enough without this fiasco." "Complicated?" Miss Marple Sit's tone was all innocence. "I suppose there were many claims on her estate." Clara's eyes flickered, but she said nothing, only sipped her tea. Miss Marple noted the slight tremble in her hand. Across the table, Gerald Winthrop, Clara's cousin, was laughing too loudly at a remark from Mrs. Clement. His charm was undeniable, flashing blue eyes, a roguish smile, but Miss Marple had seen his type before, men who lived on borrowed money and borrowed time. Mrs. Clement, ever eager to smooth tensions, changed the subject. "Now, Miss Marple, do tell us about your roses. They set the talk of the village this year." "Oh, they're no trouble at all," Miss Marple said modestly, though her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of the sliver of glass she'd found by Mr. Hargreaves' doorstep, now tucked safely in her handbag. And then there was the stranger in the grey coat, mentioned again by Mrs. Price, who swore she'd seen him near the church the previous evening. As the tea party wound down, Miss Marple caught a snatch of conversation between Dr. Haydock and the vicar. "Hargreaves is beside himself," the doctor was saying. "Says the file contained more than just the will, letters, private letters, that could cause a scandal if they got out." "Letters," the vicar murmured, his eyebrows rising. "Good heavens, no wonder he sits in a state." Miss Marple's needles paused. Letters indeed. That added a new layer to the puzzle. She rose, thanking Mrs. Clement for the tea, and made her way home, her mind buzzing. The village might look serene, but beneath the surface secrets were stirring, and secrets, as Miss Marple knew, had a way of leaving traces, sometimes in the form of a careless word at a tea party or a sliver of glass in the gravel. Chapter 4. The Locked Room Enigma. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the high street as Miss Marple approached Mr. Hargreaves' solicitor's office once more. The morning's excitement had subsided, but a quiet tension lingered, like the hum of bees in a summer garden. She had promised herself a closer look at the scene of the crime, not out of idle curiosity, of course, but because puzzles like this one demanded careful inspection. Besides, Constable Higgins, though diligent, lacked the knack for spotting the small, telling details that Miss Marple had learned to trust. The office door was ajar, and inside Mr. Hargreaves was pacing, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. Constable Higgins stood by the desk, his helmet tucked under one arm, while Peter Ellis, the clerk, sorted papers with a feverish intensity, as if hoping the missing file might materialize from sheer effort. Miss Marple knocked lightly, her basket swinging gently at her side. "Miss Marple," Hargreaves exclaimed, pausing mid-stride. "You star very kind to take such an interest. I'm afraid we star no closer to solving this wretched business." "Dear me," she said, stepping inside. "It does sound perplexing. I thought I might offer a fresh pair of eyes, if you don't mind. Sometimes a new perspective." She trailed off, her smile disarming. Hargreaves hesitated, then nodded. "By all means. The constable's sick's been over every inch, but you're stir welcome to look." Miss Marple's eyes swept the room. The office was orderly, almost oppressively so, with its rows of ledgers, a brass inkstand gleaming on the desk, and a single window overlooking a narrow alley. The window was latched, its frame undisturbed, and the door's lock showed no signs of tampering. She noted the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the air, Mr. Hargreaves' brand no doubt, and a faint smudge of wax on the desk's edge, barely noticeable. "The file was in here," Hargreaves said, tapping the central drawer of his desk. "Locked, as always. I keep the key on my person." He patted his waistcoat pocket, producing a small brass key. No one could have opened it without this. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "the file is gone." She bent to examine the drawer, her fingers brushing the brass lock. It was intact, with no scratches or dents. "Most curious. And the room was locked when you arrived this morning?" "Absolutely," Hargreaves said. "Peter opened up at 8, as usual, and found everything in order except the file." Peter Ellis, who had been silent, looked up from his papers. "I swear, Miss Marple, I checked the locks last night. Door, windows, everything. It sits like the file vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Things rarely vanish, Mr. Ellis. They're usually mislaid or moved." She glanced at the window again, noting a faint scuff mark on the sill, barely visible against the dark wood. It might have been nothing, a careless brush of a cleaner's rag, but she filed it away in her mind, alongside the sliver of glass from the doorstep. Constable Higgins cleared his throat. "Have searched the alley outside, Miss Marple. Nothing there but a few crates and some rubbish. No footprints, no broken glass. If someone got in, they left. No trace." "No trace," Miss Marple echoed, her tone thoughtful. She moved to the filing cabinet, its drawers neatly labelled with names and dates. "And this cabinet, Mr. Hargreaves, is it always locked?" "Yes," he said. "Peter has the key to that one. But the Winthrop file was never in there. I kept it in my desk for special reasons." "Special reasons?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her gaze was sharp. Hargreaves shifted uncomfortably. "The will, you see, it sits a delicate matter. Miss Winthrop Sitt's estate is substantial, and certain provisions, well, they might not sit well with some of the beneficiaries. I wanted to review it privately before the reading." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the Winthrop family. Gerald Winthrop, with his easy charm and mounting debts, stood to gain or lose a great deal. Clara Winthrop, who had cared for her aunt, might have expectations of her own. And then there were the rumors of distant cousins, circling like vultures. She thought again of the stranger in the grey coat, seen lurking near the church and the office. An outsider, perhaps, but outsiders rarely wandered into St. Mary Mead without purpose. She crossed to the window, her movements slow and deliberate, and peered into the alley below. It was narrow, bordered by a high wall on one side and the back of the bakery on the other. A stack of wooden crates sat against the wall, their edges weathered. Something about their arrangement caught her eye. They seemed slightly askew, as if recently moved. She made a mental note to mention it to Constable Higgins later, though she suspected he'd overlook it. "Tell me, Mr. Hargreaves," she said, turning back to him, who knew the file was in your desk. He frowned, rubbing his chin. "Only Peter, I suppose, and myself. I mentioned it to Dr. Haydock in passing, as he was Miss Winthrop's physician, but no one else." "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She recalled his grave expression at the vicarage tea, his mention of private letters in the file, letters that could cause a scandal. She wondered what secrets Miss Winthrop had kept, and who might have been desperate to uncover or bury them. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the door, her eyes catching a faint thread caught on the edge of a floorboard. It was grey, almost invisible against the wood, and it reminded her of the stranger's coat. She bent down, pretending to adjust her shoe, and slipped the thread into her handkerchief alongside the sliver of glass. "Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves," she said, straightening. "I shan't take up more of your time. I'm sure the file will turn up." Hargreaves managed a wan smile. "I hope you sits right, Miss Marple. This business is giving me sleepless nights." As she stepped back into the high street, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of details: the locked drawer, the scuff mark, the misplaced crates, the grey thread. It was a puzzle, indeed. But puzzles were her specialty. She thought of her garden, where every rose had its place, and how even the smallest weed could disrupt the harmony. Someone in St. Mary Mead had been careless, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. Chapter 5. Suspects emerge. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the parlour floor. She sat in her favourite armchair, her knitting idle for once, as she turned over the morning's discoveries in her mind. The locked room, the missing file, the grey thread, the sliver of glass, each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained tantalizingly incomplete. She sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the garden, where the roses swayed gently in the breeze. It was in moments like these, quiet and unhurried, that her thoughts often found clarity. The village, however, was far from quiet. News of the missing file had spread like wildfire, and by now every shop and parlour in St. Mary Mead buzzed with theories. Miss Marple knew that to unravel this mystery, she needed to understand the players involved. The Winthrop file was no ordinary document. It held the key to a fortune, and fortunes had a way of bringing out the worst in people. She decided to pay a visit to the Blue Boar, the village pub where tongues loosened over pints of ale, and where Gerald Winthrop was known to hold court. The Blue Boar was a cosy, low-ceilinged establishment, its walls darkened by years of pipe smoke and laughter. As Miss Marple entered, she was greeted by the familiar clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation. Gerald Winthrop sat at a corner table, his charm undimmed, despite the faint redness in his eyes that suggested too many late nights. He was regaling a small group, mostly farmers and shopkeepers, with a story of his latest venture in London, his hands gesturing expansively. "Miss Marple," he called, spotting her. "Come join us. Surely you're not here for the ale?" His grin was infectious, but Miss Marple noted the strain behind it. "I thought I might have a lemonade," she said, settling at a nearby table. "And perhaps a word, Mr. Winthrop, about this unfortunate business with your Aunt Set's file." The mood at Gerald Six's table shifted. The farmers muttered excuses and drifted away, leaving Gerald alone with his pint. He leaned back, his smile fading. "Bad business, that," he said. "Hargreaves is in a right state. Can Six say I blame him?" "It must be worrying for you," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Your Aunt Set's state is quite substantial, I hear." Gerald shrugged, but his fingers tightened around his glass.
"I suppose so."
Aunt Eleanor was tight-fisted, though. Never saw a penny of her money while she was alive. "Not sure I still see much now, either," with Clara sniffing about. Miss Marple Sit's eyebrows rose slightly. "Miss Clara Winthrop. She was very devoted to your aunt, wasn't she?" "Devoted?" Gerald snorted. "More like chained to her. Clara played the dutiful nurse, but I sect wager she sect's got her eye on the prize. Always was ambitious. Ah, Clara." Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her expression unreadable. Gerald's bitterness was telling, but so was his casual dismissal of his cousin. She thought of Clara's guarded demeanour at the vicarage tea, the tremble in her hand. Devotion could mask many things, love, duty, or something darker. As she chatted with Gerald, her eyes wandered to the bar, where a newcomer caught her attention. He was a tall man, his grey coat draped over a chair, his face half hidden by a newspaper. The stranger from the high street. He was nursing a whiskey, his movements deliberate, as if he were listening to more than the chatter around him. Miss Marple made a mental note of his boots, polished but flecked with mud, the kind you'd find in the alley behind Hargreaves' office. The door swung open, and Dr. Haydock entered, his medical bag in hand. He nodded to Miss Marple before joining the barman for a quick word. She overheard him mention a patient at Willow Grange, Miss Winthrop's old home, now empty but for a caretaker. Dr. Haydock's presence reminded her of his comment about the letters in the file. What secrets had Miss Winthrop kept, and who might want them silenced? Back at Gerald Sip's table, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently. "You were in London recently. Weren't you, Mr. Winthrop? Did you visit your aunt before she passed?" Gerald's stars flickered.
"Came down a few times, but she wasn't set much for visitors. Clara had her all to herself." He drained his glass and stood abruptly. "If you set'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I set've got business to attend to." She watched him go, noting the slight unsteadiness in his step. Gerald was charming, but charm could be a mask. She thought of Peter Ellis, the nervous clerk, and his claim of locking the office tight. Then there was Clara, whose devotion to her aunt might not have been entirely selfless, and the stranger in the grey coat who seemed to appear wherever the mystery deepened. As she left the Blue Boar, Miss Marple paused outside, her eyes scanning the street. The village was settling into evening, with lights glowing in cottage windows and the distant sound of a dog barking. She reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing the handkerchief that held the grey thread and the sliver of glass. 3 suspects, she thought, Gerald, Clara, and the stranger, each with motives yet to be uncovered. And then there were the letters, those scandalous letters that Hargreaves had mentioned.
What truths did they hold, and who would go to such lengths to steal them? She turned toward home, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The puzzle was growing more intricate, but Miss Marple had never shied away from complexity. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like weeds in her garden, persistent but not impossible to uproot if you knew where to look. Chapter 6. Miss Marple's Quiet Observations. The following morning dawned crisp and clear in St. Mary Mead, with a light mist clinging to the meadows beyond the village. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and after a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she donned her tweed coat and set out for Mr. Hargreaves' office. She had spent much of the previous evening mulling over the emerging suspects: Gerald Winthrop's evasive charm, Clara Winthrop's guarded silence, the mysterious stranger in the grey coat, and the tantalizing clues she had gathered: the sliver of glass, the grey thread, the faint scuff on the window-sill. But clues were like threads in her knitting. They needed to be woven together carefully to reveal the pattern. Upon arriving at the office, she found the door unlocked and Mr. Hargreaves already at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers that suggested a night of fruitless searching. Peter Ellis was in the corner, methodically flipping through a ledger, his face drawn and pale, as if sleep had eluded him as well. Constable Higgins was absent, likely pursuing leads elsewhere in the village. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said brightly, stepping inside. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was passing by and thought perhaps I might be of some small assistance again." Hargreaves looked up, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "Miss Marple, you're a welcome sight. We've turned the place upside down, but no sign of the file." The constable suggested it might have been spirited away by some professional thief, but that seems far-fetched for our little village. "Far-fetched, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but not impossible. "May I take another look around? Sometimes the smallest detail—" "Of course," Hargreaves said, gesturing wearily. "Peter, fetch Miss Marple a cup of tea, would you?" Peter Ellis nodded and hurried to the small kitchenette at the back, his steps quick and nervous. Miss Marple watched him go, noting how he avoided eye contact. She began her observations methodically, starting with the desk once more. The brass lock on the drawer gleamed under the light, but as she leaned closer, she spotted a tiny scratch near the keyhole, fresh by the look of it, as if made by a tool not quite fitting the lock. It was subtle, easily mistaken for wear, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught it. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said casually, "do you ever have trouble with this lock? It seems a bit worn." He frowned, peering over. "Not that I've noticed. Why do you ask?" "Oh, nothing," she murmured, but her mind was racing. A duplicate key, perhaps, or an attempt at picking it. She moved to the window, where the scuff mark on the sill still lingered. Kneeling down with surprising agility for her age, she examined it closely. It wasn't a scuff from a rag, as she had first thought, but more like the imprint of a shoe heel, narrow and pointed, the sort a woman might wear, or a man with finer tastes. Peter returned with the tea, setting it on a side table with a clatter. "Here you are, miss," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Milk, no sugar, as I recall from last time." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said, smiling up at him. "You have a good memory, Mr. Ellis. That must be invaluable in your work." He flushed, tugging at his cuffs. "I try, miss. It's all about the details, Mr. Hargreaves says." "Indeed," she agreed, sipping her tea. As Peter turned away, she noticed a small tear in the hem of his trousers, grey wool, matching the thread she had found by the door. Coincidence, or something more. She set her cup down and wandered to the filing cabinet, her fingers lightly tracing the labels. One drawer was slightly ajar, and inside she saw folders neatly arranged, but one label caught her eye. Winthrop Correspondence, Archived. It was empty, save for a faint outline where papers had once been. "Mr. Hargreaves," she asked, "did the missing file include any old letters? The doctor mentioned something about private correspondence." Hargreaves sighed heavily. "Yes, that's the worst of it. Miss Winthrop entrusted me with some personal letters, quite sensitive, involving a family matter from years ago. If they fall into the wrong hands, it could ruin reputations." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, but inwardly, she was piecing things together. Sensitive letters suggested blackmail or hidden scandals, motives that could drive even the most unlikely suspect to desperate acts. She thought of Clara Winthrop, who had been close to her aunt and might know of such secrets, or Gerald, whose debts could make him vulnerable to temptation. And the stranger, who was he, and what was his connection? As she continued her circuit of the room, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small waste-paper basket tucked under the desk. It was empty, but a tiny shred of paper clung to the rim, yellowed, with a fragment of handwriting that looked formal, like a legal document. She plucked it discreetly and tucked it into her sleeve, planning to examine it later under her magnifying glass at home. Peter Ellis, meanwhile, had resumed his work, but Miss Marple caught him glancing at her repeatedly, his anxiety palpable. "Mr. Ellis," she said gently, "you seem troubled. Is there something on your mind?" He startled, dropping his pen. "And no, Miss Marple, just this whole affair. It's unsettling, that's all." "Unsettling? Yes," she echoed, "especially if one feels responsible. But I'm sure you did everything properly when locking up." "Of course," he said quickly. "Too quickly, perhaps. I always do." Miss Marple finished her tea and rose to leave, thanking Hargreaves for his patience. As she stepped outside, she paused on the doorstep, her eyes scanning the gravel path. There, half buried in the dirt, was another sliver of glass, similar to the first. She picked it up, comparing it mentally to the one in her handbag. Not broken window glass, she realized, thinner, like from a spectacle lens or a watch face. Walking home, Miss Marple's mind whirred with observations. The scratch on the lock, the shoe imprint, the grey thread linking to Peter's trousers, the shred of paper, the glass slivers, and Peter's nervousness. It reminded her of a young man in her village years ago who had been coerced into petty theft by a domineering relative. Was Peter being manipulated, or was he the key to the enigma? She arrived at her cottage and settled by the window, pulling out her magnifying glass to examine the paper shred. The handwriting was faint, but she made out words like inheritance and illegitimate. A scandal. Indeed. The puzzle was deepening, but Miss Marple felt a quiet excitement. Human nature was predictable, after all, and with each observation the truth drew nearer. Chapter 7. A Midnight Alibi. The clock in Miss Marple's parlour struck 9, as she sat by her fire, her knitting in her lap but untouched. The evening had grown chilly, and the village of St. Mary Mead was tucked in for the night, its cottages dark, save for the occasional flicker of a lamp. Yet Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. The clues she had gathered, the scratch on the lock, the grey thread, the slivers of glass, the shred of paper with its tantalizing words, were like scattered petals waiting to be arranged into a bouquet of truth. Tonight she resolved to test the alibis of those closest to the mystery, starting with the nervous young clerk, Peter Ellis. Miss Marple had learned long ago that alibis were like lace doilies. They looked solid enough at a glance, but under scrutiny, their holes became apparent. Peter had claimed he went straight home after locking Mr. Hargreaves' office at 6 the previous evening with his landlady, Mrs. Baxter, to vouch for him. Miss Marple decided a visit to Mrs. Baxter's boarding house was in order. It was late for calling, but village life allowed for certain liberties, especially under the guise of neighbourly concern. Slipping on her coat and hat, Miss Marple stepped into the night, her small flashlight casting a soft beam on the cobblestone path.
Mrs. Baxter's boarding house was a modest two-story building near the church, its windows aglow with the warm light of paraffin lamps.
Miss Marple knocked gently, and the door was opened by Mrs. Baxter herself, a stout woman with a flour-dusted apron and a perpetually harried expression. "Miss Marple!" Mrs. Baxter exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you out at this hour? Not more trouble, I hope?" "Oh, nothing so dramatic," Miss Marple said with a reassuring smile. "I was simply passing by and thought to ask after young Mr. Ellis. His business with the missing file must be weighing on him." Mrs. Baxter ushered her into the cramped parlour, where a fire crackled in the grate. "Poor lad's been a bundle of nerves," she said, lowering her voice. "He came home right on time last night, just after 6, and went straight to his room. Didn't Set even touch his supper, which isn't Set's like him." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair. "And he stayed in all evening, I presume?" "As far as I know," Mrs. Baxter said, but her eyes darted to the side, and Miss Marple caught the hesitation. "I mean, I was busy in the kitchen, but I still have heard if he went out. Those stairs creak something awful." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her mind alert. She thought of the grey thread, so like the fabric of Peter Sip's trousers, and the nervous way he tugged at his cuffs. "Did anyone call for him? A friend, perhaps?" Mrs. Baxter frowned, her hands twisting in her apron. "Well, now you mention it, I did hear voices outside around 9. Couldn't make out who, mind you, and I didn't see Peter leave, but there was someone in the yard, talking low-like. I thought it might be that Gerald Winthrop, he's been round before, asking Peter for favours." "Favours?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, nothing serious," Mrs. Baxter said quickly. "Just borrowing a bit of money now and then. Gerald sits always short. You know how he is." Miss Marple did know. Gerald's debts were the talk of the Blue Boar, and his charm had a way of coaxing help from even the most reluctant. She thanked Mrs. Baxter and made her way back into the night, her flashlight bobbing along the path. The conversation had raised more questions than answers. Peter's alibi held, but only just, and the mention of Gerald added a new thread to the tapestry. Her next stop was the Blue Boar, where she knew Gerald Winthrop often lingered. The pub was quieter now, with only a few regulars nursing their pints. Gerald was at his usual table, a glass of whiskey in hand, his tie loosened, and his smile less polished than usual. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple." Twice in one day he said, forcing a grin. "You still have me thinking I stum under suspicion." "Not at all," she said, taking a seat opposite him. "I was merely curious about your evening last night, Mr. Winthrop. With all this fuss about the file, I imagine you were as anxious as the rest of us." Gerald Sip's grin faltered. "Last night, I was here, same as always. Ask Tom behind the bar. He still tell you I was propping up his counter till closing." Miss Marple Sip's eyes twinkled. "And what time would that be?" 11, maybe past, Gerald said, swirling his whiskey. "Then I went home to my lodgings. Nothing exciting. I am afraid. She nodded, her gaze drifting to his boots. They were scuffed, but not with the mud she'd seen on the stranger's shoes. Still, his casual manner seemed forced, and she recalled Mrs. Baxter's mention of voices in the yard. You didn't happen to visit Mr. Ellis, did you? I hear you're friendly with him. Gerald's hand paused on his glass. Peter? No, haven't seen him in days. Why do you ask? Oh, just village talk, Miss Marple said airily. People do love to speculate. As she left the pub, she mulled over Gerald's alibi. The barman would likely confirm it, but that didn't account for the hours between 6 and 9 when the file had likely disappeared. And then there was the stranger in the grey coat. She hadn't seen him tonight, but his presence nagged at her. Who was he, and why was he lingering in St. Mary Mead? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, pulling out her magnifying glass to examine the shred of paper from the office. The words, inheritance and illegitimate, were clearer now, and a third fragment read 1912. A scandal from decades ago perhaps, tied to the Winthrop family. She thought of Clara Winthrop, who had been so close to her aunt. Had Clara known of these letters, or was someone else desperate to keep them hidden? The night grew quieter, but Miss Marple's mind was anything but. Alibis were shaky, motives were emerging, and the puzzle was far from solved. She set her magnifying glass down and picked up her knitting, the rhythmic click of the needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Someone in St. Mary Mead had been abroad last night, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who. Chapter 8. Hidden Motives Revealed. The sun hung low in the sky as Miss Marple made her way to Willow Grange, the late Miss Winthrop's imposing home on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. The house, a rambling Victorian structure with ivy-cloaked walls and tall chimneys, stood silent now, its windows shuttered like closed eyes. Miss Marple had decided that to understand the missing file, she needed to delve deeper into the Winthrop family's past, and Willow Grange was where those secrets likely lay buried. The caretaker, old Mr. Jenkins, had agreed to let her in for a spot of reminiscing, as she had put it, though her true purpose was far more investigative. Mr. Jenkins, a weathered man with a limp from the Great War, greeted her at the gate with a tip of his cap. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "Sad business all this." Miss Winthrop was a fine lady, rest her soul. "Indeed she was," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm with sympathy. "I thought I might look around, if it's no trouble. Memories, you know. They have a way of clarifying things." Jenkins nodded and led her up the gravel drive, unlocking the heavy oak door with a key from his chain. The interior was dim and musty, with dust sheets draped over furniture like ghosts in waiting. Miss Marple's eyes adjusted to the gloom, taking in the grand staircase, the portraits of stern Winthrop ancestors lining the walls, and the faint scent of lavender that lingered from Miss Winthrop's favourite sachets. "Miss Clara's been by a few times," Jenkins said as they entered the drawing-room, sorting through her aunt's things. "Gerald too, though he's more interested in the silver, if you ask me." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Sorting? Have they taken much away?" "Not that I've seen," Jenkins replied, scratching his head. "But Miss Clara was in the study yesterday, going through the desk drawers. Said she was looking for family papers." The study was a cosy room at the back of the house, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her fingers trailing over the polished surface. The drawers were unlocked, and inside she found stacks of old letters, yellowed with age, tied with faded ribbons. She untied one bundle carefully, scanning the contents. They were from the 1910s, addressed to Miss Winthrop's mother, mentioning a family indiscretion and a child born out of wedlock in 1912. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, tying the bundle back. The shred of paper from Hargreaves' office matched this handwriting perfectly. So the letters in the file were about an illegitimate heir, perhaps a motive for theft, if someone stood to lose their inheritance. Jenkins hovered by the door, his eyes watchful. "Miss Winthrop kept her secrets close," he said. "But she confided in me once or twice. That child, you see, it was her sister's, but the family hushed it up, sent the boy away to relatives in Australia. If he were to claim the estate now—" Miss Marple's mind whirled. An unknown heir could upend everything. Did Clara know? Or Gerald? And what of the stranger in the grey coat? Could he be the long-lost relative come to steal proof of his claim? She moved to the window, which overlooked the garden, now overgrown with weeds. A faint footprint in the soft earth caught her eye, narrow like the scuff on Hargreaves' sill. "Mr. Jenkins," she said casually, "has anyone else visited recently? A stranger, perhaps?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "Well now, you mention it, there was a fellow here 2 days ago. Tall chap in a grey coat, said he was a distant cousin, inquiring about the family history. I sent him packing." Miss Winthrop's instructions were clear. No visitors without appointment. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions growing. The stranger had motive, then, if he was the illegitimate heir seeking evidence. But how did he enter the locked office? She thanked Jenkins and made her way back to the village, stopping at Dr. Haydock's surgery on the way. The doctor, a bluff man with a kind heart, was just finishing with a patient when she arrived. "Miss Marple," he said, ushering her in, "I suppose this is about the Winthrop file. Hargreaves is still in a flap." "Quite," she said, settling into a chair. "You mentioned letters, doctor-sensitive ones. Might they involve a family secret from 1912? Dr. Haydock's eyebrows shot up. "How on earth?" "Tess, Miss Winthrop told me, in confidence during her illness. Her sister had a child out of wedlock. A boy. He was adopted out. But Miss Winthrop kept papers proving his lineage. She intended to leave him a portion in her will, which would cut into Clara and Gerald's shares." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And did Clara or Gerald know?" "Clara did. She nursed her aunt and overheard things. Gerald, I'm not sure, but he's been desperate for money, gambling debts and such. As for Clara, she's always resented the family for favouring her aunt over her own parents." The motives were crystallizing. Gerald, needing cash to pay debts, might steal the file to destroy evidence of the heir and secure his full inheritance. Clara, harbouring resentment, could do the same to claim more for herself. And the stranger, if he was the heir, might want the file to prove his claim. As she left the surgery, Miss Marple spotted Peter Ellis hurrying down the street, his face flushed. He nearly collided with her, before stopping short. "Miss Marple, I am sorry." "No harm done," she said gently. "You seem in a rush, Mr. Ellis." He glanced around nervously. "Just errands. For Mr. Hargreaves." But Miss Marple noted a bulge in his coat pocket, like a bundle of papers. Was Peter involved after all? Perhaps coerced by Gerald, as Mrs. Baxter had hinted. That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple pieced it together over a cup of tea. Hidden motives abounded: greed, resentment, desperation. The file's disappearance was no simple theft. It was a bid to alter fates. But who had the means to enter the locked room? She thought of the slivers of glass, perhaps from a broken watch crystal, smashed in haste, and the grey thread linking Peter or the stranger. The puzzle was nearing its centre, but Miss Marple knew patience was key. Human frailties, once revealed, often led straight to the truth. Chapter 9. The Garden Party Interruption. The gardens of the vicarage were abloom with the vibrant colours of late summer, roses and dahlias nodding in the gentle breeze as guests mingled on the manicured lawn. Mrs. Clement's annual garden party was a highlight of St. Mary Mead's social calendar, a chance for the villagers to don their finest hats and exchange pleasantries over plates of finger sandwiches and Victoria sponge. But this year, the air hummed with more than just the buzz of bees. The missing Winthrop file was the unspoken undercurrent, flavouring every conversation like a dash of bitters in a sweet tea. Miss Marple arrived fashionably on time, her straw hat adorned with a simple ribbon, her basket over one arm containing a jar of her homemade damson jam as a contribution to the raffle. "Constable," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard over the chatter. "Any progress on that puzzling disappearance?" Higgins straightened, wiping crumbs from his moustache. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. We're pursuing leads, as they say. Interviewed young Ellis again this morning. He sticks to his story, but he's jumpy as a cat on a hot tin roof." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the crowd. Clara Winthrop stood stiffly by the rose arbour, her black dress a stark contrast to the colourful frocks around her, engaged in terse conversation with Dr. Haydock. Gerald Winthrop, ever the charmer, was laughing with a group of young ladies, but his eyes darted nervously toward the vicarage gates. And there, near the hedge, was the stranger in the grey coat, sipping lemonade, as if he belonged, though his gaze seemed fixed on the Winthrops. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured. She accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Clement, who fluttered over with her usual enthusiasm. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it lovely? Though with all this talk of theft, one hardly knows what to think," Mrs. Clement said, her cheeks flushed. "Mr. Hargreaves says the file held dreadful secrets, family skeletons, you know." "Skeletons have a way of rattling at the worst times," Miss Marple replied mildly, but her mind was on the letters from 1912, the illegitimate heir. She sipped her tea, observing Clara's rigid posture. The woman looked as if she might snap like a dry twig. As the party progressed, the vicar announced a game of croquet, drawing cheers from the younger guests. Miss Marple declined to play, preferring to sit on a bench with a view of the lawn. It was there that Peter Ellis approached her, his face pale and his hands clasped tightly. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder, "I need to speak with you, privately." She patted the bench beside her. "Of course, Mr. Ellis. Sit down. You look quite distressed." Peter sat, his knees bouncing nervously. "It's about the file. I didn't take it, I swear. But I think I know something. Last night, after locking up, I saw someone in the alley behind the office. A shadow, really. But it looked like Gerald Winthrop. He was arguing with someone. Harsh whispers, you know." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Arguing? Could you hear what about?" "Money, I think. Gerald said something like, 'I need it now or everything falls apart.' Then the other person, I couldn't see who, replied, 'The file changes everything.' Then they were gone." Before Miss Marple could probe further, a commotion erupted near the gates. Mr. Hargreaves burst into the garden, his face red and his tie askew, waving a piece of paper like a flag of surrender. "It's a ransom note," he shouted, drawing gasps from the crowd. "Delivered to my door this morning. They want £500 for the file, or they'll burn it." The party froze, all eyes on Hargreaves. Constable Higgins pushed through the guests, taking the note. "Let me see that. Leave the money in the old oak by the church at midnight, or the Winthrop secrets go up in smoke. Unsigned, of course." Clara Winthrop stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is outrageous. Who would do such a thing?" Gerald, his charm slipping, muttered, "Probably some opportunist. But why the file? What's so valuable?" Miss Marple watched them closely. Clara's indignation seemed genuine, but Gerald's face had gone ashen, and the stranger, he had slipped away during the uproar, vanishing like mist in the sun. Dr. Haydock examined the note over Higgins' shoulder. Handwritings disguised, block letters. "But look here, there's a smudge, like ink from a leaky pen. Reminds me of the one in your office, Hargreaves." Peter Ellis, still beside Miss Marple, whispered, "That's not possible. Our pens are fine." Miss Marple patted his hand reassuringly, but her mind was racing. The ransom note added a new layer, blackmail perhaps, or a diversion. She thought of the slivers of glass, the grey thread, the footprint, and now this note, interrupting the garden party like a thunderclap. As the guests murmured and the vicar called for calm, Miss Marple rose quietly. "Constable," she said, approaching him, "might I see the note? Just a glance." Higgins handed it over reluctantly. The paper was ordinary, but the ink smudge was indeed telling, blue-black with a faint shimmer like from a fountain pen. And there, caught in the fold, was a tiny fibre grey wool. "Most revealing," she said softly, handing it back. The interruption had shaken the village, but for Miss Marple it was another piece falling into place. Someone was desperate, and desperation often led to mistakes. She glanced at the empty spot where the stranger had stood, wondering if the midnight drop would draw him out, or someone closer to home. The garden party resumed, but the joy had evaporated, leaving only whispers and sidelong glances. Miss Marple helped herself to a slice of cake, her expression serene. The game was afoot, and midnight promised more revelations. Chapter 10. False Leads and Red Herrings. The evening shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead as Constable Higgins made his way to the Blue Boar, his notebook tucked firmly under his arm and a determined set to his jaw. The ransom note from the garden party had stirred the village into a frenzy, and Higgins, feeling the weight of Scotland Yard's distant oversight, was eager to make an arrest. His suspicions had fallen squarely on Gerald Winthrop, whose debts were no secret and whose alibi for the night of the disappearance had holes large enough to drive a cart through. Miss Marple, however, sitting quietly in her cottage parlour with a cup of chamomile tea, harboured doubts. She had seen too many cases where the obvious suspect was merely a convenient distraction, like a flashy red herring in one of her nephew Raymond's detective novels. At the pub, Higgins found Gerald nursing a pint, his usual charm replaced by a sullen glare. The constable wasted no time, pulling up a chair with a scrape that turned heads. "Mr. Winthrop," Higgins said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "I've a few more questions about your whereabouts the night the file went missing. And this ransom note smells like desperation to me." Gerald set his glass down with a thud, his eyes narrowing. "I've told you already, Constable. I was here till closing. Then home. Ask Tom. He'll vouch for me." The barman Tom nodded from behind the counter, polishing a glass with deliberate slowness. He was here. Left around 11. Same as always. Higgins leaned in, his mustache twitching. But what about earlier? Between 6 and 9. Peter Ellis says he heard voices in the alley, sounding like an argument over money. And Mrs. Baxter mentioned you visiting her boarding house around 9. Gerald's face flushed, but he held his ground. Nonsense. I was here from 7 onward. As for money, yes, I've debts. Who hasn't? But stealing a file? That's not my style. Miss Marple, who had decided on a discreet evening stroll that conveniently passed the Blue Boar, lingered outside the window, her ears attuned to the raised voices. She noted Gerald's defensiveness, but also the way his hands shook, not from guilt, she thought, but from fear. Fear of what, though? She slipped inside quietly, taking a seat at a corner table with a glass of elderflower cordial, her presence unnoticed amid the growing crowd of onlookers. Higgins pressed on, producing the ransom note from his pocket. This ink smudge matches the pen in Hargreaves' office, and that grey fibre looks like it could come from your coat, Mr. Winthrop. Gerald laughed bitterly. My coat's brown, constable, and half the village uses fountain pens. You're barking up the wrong tree. But Higgins was undeterred. We'll see about that. I'm taking you in for questioning. Proper questioning down at the station. The pub erupted in murmurs as Higgins led Gerald out, the young man's protests echoing down the street. Miss Marple watched them go, her lips pursed in thought. It was all too neat, too obvious. Gerald had motive, yes, but the ransom note seemed designed to point fingers, perhaps away from the real culprit. She recalled the grey thread and fibre, which matched not Gerald's coat but the stranger's, and possibly Peter's trousers, and the slivers of glass. They nagged at her, like a loose stitch in her knitting. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Mr. Hargreaves' office, where the solicitor was pacing anxiously, the ransom deadline looming at midnight. Peter Ellis was there too, his face even paler than usual, shuffling papers with trembling hands. Constable Higgins seems convinced it's Gerald, Hargreaves said, sinking into his chair, but I can't believe it. Gerald's feckless, but a thief? Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her voice gentle. Belief is one thing, Mr. Hargreaves, but evidence is another. Tell me, have you noticed anything missing besides the file? A pen, perhaps, or a spare key? Hargreaves frowned. A pen? Well, my favourite fountain pen did go missing a few days ago. Leaky thing, always smudging. But that's hardly relevant. Oh, but it might be, Miss Marple said, her eyes bright. She thought of the ink smudge on the note, blue-black, shimmering, just like Hargreaves described. Stolen, perhaps, to plant a false trail. Peter shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple, do you think Gerald did it? She turned to him, her gaze kind but piercing. What do you think, Mr. Ellis? You know him better than most, from what I hear. Peter flushed.
He's borrowed money from me before.
Said he was in trouble with bookies. But stealing? I don't know. Miss Marple nodded, filing away his words. Borrowed money, coercion, perhaps. She left the office and headed to Clara Winthrop's cottage, a neat little place on the edge of the village. Clara answered the door with her usual sharpness, her eyes red-rimmed as if from lack of sleep. Miss Marple, she said curtly, if you're here about Gerald, good riddance. He's always been trouble. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, accepting the offered chair in the tidy parlour. But trouble doesn't always mean guilt. You knew about the letters in the file, didn't you? The ones about the family secret from 1912. Clara's hand froze on the teapot. How? Aunt Eleanor mentioned it once, in her delirium. An illegitimate cousin, somewhere in Australia. If he claims the estate, Gerald and I get nothing. And you? Miss Marple pressed softly. Would that bother you? Clara's lips thinned. I've earned my share, nursing her all those years, but I didn't steal the file. I was home that night, alone. An alibi without witness? Convenient, Miss Marple thought. As she left, she spotted a pair of narrow-heeled shoes by the door, muddied at the edges, reminiscent of the footprint at Willow Grange and the scuff on the sill. Back home, Miss Marple sat with her clues spread on the table, the slivers of glass, the grey thread, the paper shred, the ink description. The police were chasing Gerald, but she suspected a red herring planted to divert attention. The stranger remained elusive, but his grey coat matched the fibre perfectly. And Peter, his nervousness, suggested involvement, perhaps unwilling. As midnight approached, Miss Marple decided to watch the old oak by the church, where the ransom was to be left. Higgins would be there, no doubt, but she had her own ways of observing unseen. The false leads were piling up, but Miss Marple knew that truth, like cream, always rose to the top. Chapter 11. An Unexpected Confession. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its pale light casting eerie shadows across the churchyard as Miss Marple settled into her vantage point behind a yew tree near the old oak. She had wrapped herself in a dark shawl, her small figure blending seamlessly with the night, her senses sharpened by the thrill of the chase. The ransom note had demanded £500 be left in the oak's hollow by midnight, and Constable Higgins, predictably, was stationed nearby, his silhouette visible against the church wall. But Miss Marple's instincts told her the real action might unfold elsewhere, or that the culprit might reveal themselves through carelessness. As the church clock chimed 11:30, a rustle in the bushes drew her attention. A figure emerged, moving cautiously toward the oak. It was Peter Ellis, his nervous gait unmistakable even in the dim light. He carried a small parcel, which he placed inside the hollow before glancing around and retreating into the shadows. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Was Peter the thief after all, or merely a pawn in a larger scheme? She waited, her breath steady despite the chill. Moments later, another figure approached, not the stranger in the grey coat, as she had half expected, but Clara Winthrop, her narrow-heeled shoes clicking softly on the path. Clara peered into the hollow, hesitated, then withdrew without touching the parcel. Her face, caught briefly in the moonlight, was taut with anger or fear. Miss Marple couldn't be sure which. The clock struck midnight, and no one else appeared. Higgins, growing impatient, retrieved the parcel, a bundle of blank papers, not money, and cursed under his breath. The trap had failed, but Miss Marple's mind was ablaze with new connections. Peter's involvement was undeniable now, but Clara's presence suggested she knew more than she let on. The next morning, Miss Marple invited Peter Ellis to her cottage under the pretense of discussing her own modest will. He arrived promptly, his face drawn, his hands fidgeting as he sat in her cosy parlour. She offered him tea, her manner as soothing as a grandmother's, but her eyes missed nothing, the faint ink stain on his cuff, the way he avoided looking at her knitting basket, where the grey thread lay hidden. "Mr. Ellis," she began, pouring tea with deliberate care, "you've been under a great deal of strain. I saw you last night. At the Oak. Quite a curious place to be at midnight." Peter Sepp's cup rattled in its saucer. and his face went white. "Miss Marple, I can explain. I didn't steal the file, I swear." "Then perhaps you'd tell me what you were doing," she said gently, her tone inviting confession. Peter buried his face in his hands, his voice trembling. "It was Gerald. He came to me 2 nights ago, after hours, begging for help. Said he owed money to some rough types in London, and if he didn't pay, they'd ruin him. He asked me to take the file, just for a day, to make copies of the will. He thought he could sell the information to someone who'd pay to keep the secrets quiet." Miss Marple's 6 eyebrows rose slightly. "And did you take it?" "No," Peter said, his voice rising. "I refused, but the next morning the file was gone, and Gerald said I'd be blamed if I told anyone. He made me write the ransom note, said it was to throw the police off. I didn't know what else to do, so I put those papers in the oak last night, hoping it'd satisfy him." Miss Marple leaned back, her mind sifting through his words. Peter's confession explained the note and the ink smudge, his leaky pen no doubt borrowed from Hargreaves' desk. But it didn't account for the file's actual disappearance and the glass slivers I found, she asked. "Near the office door and in the gravel." Peter blinked, confused. "Glass? I don't know anything about that. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't touch the file." She believed him. His fear was too raw, his story too haphazard to be a lie. But someone had taken the file, and the glass slivers pointed to a specific kind of carelessness. She thought of the stranger's polished boots, flecked with mud, and Clara's muddy shoes at the churchyard. And the grey thread. Peter's trousers matched, but so did the stranger's coat. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis," she said, patting his hand. "You've done the right thing by telling me. Now go back to Mr. Hargreaves and say nothing of this to anyone, not even Gerald." Peter nodded, relief flooding his face as he left. Miss Marple sat quietly, her tea growing cold. Gerald's coercion of Peter was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. The file was still missing, and the real thief had orchestrated a clever diversion. She recalled Clara's late-night visit to the oak, checking the hollow perhaps to see if the file was there, or to ensure her own secrets remained safe. Miss Marple rose and retrieved her clues from the knitting basket, the slivers of glass, the grey thread, the paper shred. She examined the glass again, under her magnifying glass. It wasn't from a spectacle lens or a watch crystal, as she'd first thought, but thinner, curved, like from a small vial, perhaps a chemist's bottle. A new possibility flickered in her mind. Dr. Haydock had mentioned visiting Willow Grange recently. Could he have dropped something? Or was the glass a relic of someone else's presence? As she tidied her parlour, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the stranger in the grey coat. He had been at Willow Grange, the office, the garden party, always watching, never engaging. If he was the illegitimate heir, he had the strongest motive to steal the file and prove his claim. But how had he entered the locked office? The scratch on the lock suggested skill, not force. The confession had cracked the case open, but the truth lay deeper. Miss Marple knew the next move was to confront Clara, whose midnight wanderings suggested knowledge or guilt. The puzzle was tightening, and with it the noose around the true culprit. Chapter 12. Piecing Together. The Puzzle. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the cottages and lending an air of mystery to the quiet lanes. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, a pot of tea steaming beside her, as she spread out her collection of clues, the 2 slivers of glass, the grey thread, the shred of paper with its tantalizing words, inheritance illegitimate, 1912, and her notes from Peter Ellis's confession. The puzzle of the missing Winthrop file was beginning to take shape, like a half-finished jigsaw, where the edges were clear, but the center remained elusive. She sipped her tea, her mind weaving together the village's whispers, alibis, and subtle inconsistencies. Peter's confession had confirmed Gerald Winthrop's role in the ransom note scheme, but Miss Marple was certain Gerald hadn't stolen the file. His desperation was real, but his actions were clumsy, more bluster than cunning. Clara Winthrop, with her sharp eyes and muddy shoes, was another matter. Her midnight visit to the oak suggested she knew more than she admitted. And then there was the stranger in the grey coat, whose elusive presence tied too neatly to the grey thread and the mud-flecked boots. The slivers of glass, now identified as likely from a chemist's vial, pointed to a specific act, perhaps a bottle broken in haste during the theft. Miss Marple decided to revisit the village's gossip, which often held truths hidden in plain sight. She began her day at the post office, where Mrs. Price, ever eager to share the latest news, was sorting letters with her usual vigor. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her basket swinging lightly. "I suppose the village is still abuzz about the Winthrop file." Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed. "Oh, Miss Marple, you can't imagine. They say Gerald's been arrested, but I heard from Mrs. Baxter that Peter Ellis was acting strange, sneaking about at all hours, and then there's that stranger, the one in the grey coat. My cousin's boy saw him near Willow Grange again, poking around the garden." "Poking around?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest sharpened. "When was this?" "Yesterday evening, just before dusk," Mrs. Price said, leaning over the counter. "He was looking at the windows, like he was planning something. Shifty, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded. Filing this away, the stranger's persistence at Willow Grange suggested he was searching for something, perhaps the file, or more evidence of his claim as the illegitimate heir. She thanked Mrs. Price and moved on to the bakery, where the baker's wife, Mrs. Lane, was another font of village lore. Mrs. Lane was kneading dough when Miss Marple entered, her apron dusted with flour. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said. "Heard about the ransom note. Sounds like something out of a novel. But I'll tell you what, Clara Winthrop was in here yesterday buying a loaf, and she was all nerves. Dropped her purse, and out fell a little glass bottle, one of those chemist's vials, smashed on the floor. It did." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "A vial? Did you see what was in it?" "Nothing but air, far as I could tell," Mrs. Lane said. She was flustered, swept it up quick, said it was for her headaches. "But she didn't look poorly to me." A chemist's vial, matching the slivers of glass. Miss Marple's mind raced. Clara, with her access to Willow Grange and her knowledge of the family secrets, could have entered the office, perhaps with a duplicate key or a lock-picking tool, and dropped the vial in her haste. The muddy shoes, the footprint at Willow Grange, the scuff on the office sill, all pointed to her. But why steal the file? To destroy the evidence of the heir, securing her inheritance, or to protect her aunt's reputation? Next, Miss Marple visited Dr. Haydock, whose surgery was quiet that morning. He greeted her warmly, though his face was lined with worry. "Doctor," she said, settling into a chair, "you mentioned Miss Winthrop's letters about the 1912 scandal. Did Clara ever discuss them with you?" Dr. Haydock rubbed his chin. Not directly, but she was curious about her Aunt Sit's papers when I visited Willow Grange during her illness, asked if there were any old letters that might Sit cause trouble. Assured her they were with Hargreaves, safe in his office. Miss Marple Sict's eyes twinkled. And did you ever use a chemist Sict's vial for her Aunt Sict's medication? Something small, perhaps, that might break easily. He frowned, thinking. Yes, I prescribed a sedative for Miss Winthrop Sit's nerves, small glass vials, about an inch long. Clara often collected them from the chemist for her. The pieces were aligning. Clara had motive, opportunity, and now a direct link to the glass slivers. But Miss Marple wasn't ready to dismiss the stranger or Peter entirely. The grey thread could belong to either, and Peter's involvement with Gerald suggested he might know more than he'd confessed. As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the churchyard, where the old oak stood silent, its hollow empty, now that Higgins had retrieved the decoy parcel. She paused, her eyes catching a glint in the grass, a third sliver of glass, identical to the others. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her thoughts turning to the stranger. If he was the heir, he might have confronted Clara, leading to her midnight visit to check the oak, or perhaps he was working with her, an unlikely alliance to secure the file. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple laid out her clues once more, sketching a mental map of connections. Clara's vial, her knowledge of the letters, her muddy shoes, the stranger's grey coat, his lurking at Willow Grange, Peter's coerced note, his nervous demeanour, Gerald's debts, his manipulation of Peter. The file's disappearance was no random act. It was a calculated move, tied to the 1912 secret and the Winthrop fortune. She poured another cup of tea, her mind settling on a plan. The next step was to draw the players together, to watch their reactions and catch the lie that would unravel the truth. The village was a small stage, and Miss Marple knew how to direct its actors to reveal their secrets. Chapter 13. The Final Confrontation. The drawing room of the vicarage was aglow with a soft light of oil lamps, casting a warm but solemn atmosphere over the gathered group. Miss Marple had suggested to Mrs. Clement that a small gathering might help ease the village's tensions over the missing Winthrop file, and the vicar's wife, ever eager to play hostess, had readily agreed. The invitation list was carefully curated. Mr. Hargreaves, Peter Ellis, Clara Winthrop, Dr. Haydock, Constable Higgins, and to everyone's surprise, the stranger in the grey coat, who introduced himself as Mr. James Thornton, a distant cousin of the Winthrops. Miss Marple had ensured his presence by dropping a discreet note at his lodging, hinting that the file's fate might be discussed. As the guests sipped tea and nibbled on Mrs. Clement's scones, Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her small figure commanding the room with quiet authority. Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, moved from face to face, noting the nervous fidgeting of Peter, the sullen defiance of Gerald, Clara's tightly clasped hands, and Thornton's guarded expression. The air was thick with anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but clear. "This unfortunate business with Miss Winthrop Sip's file has caused quite a stir, and I thought it might help to put our heads together. After all, in a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets have a way of coming to light." Hargreaves shifted in his chair, his face pale. "Miss Marple, if you know something, please tell us. The file Sip's absence is a disaster for the estate, for my reputation." She nodded sympathetically. "Indeed, Mr. Hargreaves. Let us start with the facts. The file, containing Miss Winthrop Sitt's will and sensitive letters from 1912, vanished from a locked desk in a locked room. No signs of forced entry, yet the file was gone by morning. Curious, isn't it? Constable Higgins cleared his throat. We said got Gerald in our sights, Miss Marple. His debts, the ransom note, it all points to him. Gerald bristled, slamming his teacup down. That's nonsense. I admit I tried to pressure Peter into copying the will, but I didn't steal it. I was at the Blue Boar that night. Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile disarming. Quite so, Mr. Winthrop. Your alibi holds, thanks to Tom at the pub. But let us consider other clues. She reached into her handbag and produced her handkerchief, unfolding it to reveal the slivers of glass, the grey thread, and the shred of paper. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. These slivers, she continued, are from a chemist's vial, broken perhaps in haste. I found them near the office door and in the churchyard. And this thread, grey wool, matches certain garments in this room. She glanced at Peter, then at Thornton, whose grey coat hung over his chair. Peter Sett's face flushed. I told you, Miss Marple, I didn't take the file. Gerald made me write the note, but that's all. Clara Store's voice cut through, sharp and cold. Are you accusing me, Miss Marple? I've done nothing but care for my aunt. Miss Marple turned to her, her tone gentle but probing. Miss Clara, you were seen at the Oak last night, checking the hollow, and your shoes muddied, with a narrow heel, much like the footprint at Willow Grange, and the scuff on Mr. Hargreaves' sill. You knew about the 1912 letters, didn't you? About the illegitimate heir who could claim part of the estate. Clara Sitt's face went white, her hands trembling. I only wanted to protect Aunt Eleanor Sitt's memory. Those letters would ruin our name. Thornton spoke for the first time, his voice low and measured. And what of me, Miss Marple? You invited me here, so you must suspect something. She met his gaze, unflinching. Mr. Thornton, you claim to be a cousin, but your interest in Willow Grange and the office suggests more. Are you perhaps the child born in 1912, sent to Australia, and now returned to claim your share? A gasp rippled through the room. Thornton Sitt's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. My mother was Miss Winthrop Sitt's sister, he said slowly. I learned of my birthright only recently. I came to find proof, the letters in that file. Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the final pieces. The file was taken to control the estate's division, but also to hide or reveal a scandal. Mr. Ellis, your nervousness and the grey thread pointed to you, but I believe you were coerced. Mr. Winthrop, your debts made you a suspect, but your actions were too reckless for theft. Miss Clara, your access to Willow Grange and the vial link you closely. And Mr. Thornton, your presence at key moments suggests intent. She paused, letting the tension build. But the truth lies in the method. The lock was scratched, suggesting a duplicate key or a pick. The vial was broken, likely during a hurried exit. And the ransom note? A distraction, written by Mr. Ellis, but orchestrated by someone cleverer. All eyes turned to Clara, who stood abruptly, her chair scraping. This is absurd. I didn't see. Miss Marple raised a hand. Miss Clara, you had a key to the office, didn't you? From when you helped your aunt with her affairs, you took the file to destroy the letters, fearing the heir's claim would diminish your share. But you dropped the vial in your haste, and the glass betrayed you. Clara Rast's composure cracked, tears welling in her eyes. I only wanted what was mine. I cared for her for years, while Gerald squandered everything. Those letters would dragged our name through the mud. Thornton stood, his voice steady. And I only wanted my due. I didn't steal the file. I was searching for it, yes, but I never entered the office. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you, Mr. Thornton. The file is likely still in Miss Marple's possession or hidden nearby. Higgins stepped forward, his notebook ready. Miss Winthrop, where is it? Clara sank back into her chair, defeated. In my cottage, under the floorboards in the parlor. I meant to burn it, but I couldn't set. The room exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her work nearly done. The confrontation had drawn out the truth, but one final twist awaited, one she kept to herself for now. Chapter 14. The Shocking Twist. The vicarage drawing-room was hushed as Constable Higgins escorted Clara Winthrop out, her head bowed, her confession still echoing in the air. The file, she had admitted, was hidden beneath the floorboards of her cottage parlor, a desperate attempt to secure her inheritance and protect the Winthrop name from the scandal of an illegitimate heir. The gathered guests, Mr. Hargreaves, Peter Ellis, Gerald Winthrop, Dr. Haydock, and James Thornton sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling like dust after a storm. But Miss Marple, standing quietly by the fireplace, knew the puzzle was not yet complete. There was one final twist, a thread she had yet to pull. As Higgins prepared to retrieve the file, Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice soft but commanding. One moment, Constable. There is something more to consider. Miss Clara's actions explain much, but not all. The slivers of glass, the grey thread, the scratched lock, these point to a second hand in this affair. The room stirred, heads turning toward her. Gerald Winthrop, his face pale, leaned forward. What are you saying, Miss Marple? Clara Stuffed confessed. Isn't stuffed that enough? She smiled faintly, her eyes moving to James Thornton, who sat rigid, his grey coat folded neatly over his arm. Mr. Thornton, you've been most forthcoming about your claim as the heir from 1912, but your presence in St. Mary Mead, your visits to Willow Grange, and your watchfulness at the garden party suggest more than curiosity. Tell me, did you ever attempt to enter Mr. Hargreaves' office? Thornton's jaw tightened, but he met her gaze steadily. I told you, Miss Marple, I never entered the office. I searched Willow Grange for papers, yes, but the file was already gone. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the handkerchief in her pocket, where the grey thread and glass slivers lay. And yet the grey thread I found matches your coat perfectly, and the glass thin, curved, like a chemist's vial, but perhaps not Clara's. I've been thinking about those slivers. They weren't from a vial at all, were they? They were from a watch crystal, broken perhaps when you tried to pick the office lock. A murmur rippled through the room. Thornton's composure faltered, his hand twitching toward his pocket. That's preposterous, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but relentless. You see, Clara took the file to protect her inheritance, but you, Mr. Thornton, were after it first. You arrived in St. Mary Mead, knowing of your birthright, thanks to letters your mother left behind. You tried to break into the office the night before Clara, but you failed. The lock was scratched, your watch crystal shattered in the attempt, leaving slivers by the door and in the churchyard, where you later watched the ransom drop. Clara, by chance or design, succeeded where you failed, using her aunt's old key. Thornton stood abruptly, his face flushed. You sip no proof. A thread, some glass. Those could belong to anyone. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, undeterred. But your boots, Mr. Thornton polished, but flecked with mud, from the alley behind the office. And your watch, she gestured to his wrist, where a new watch gleamed, its crystal intact. You replaced it quickly, didn't you, after breaking the old one? Dr. Haydock leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple, are you suggesting Thornton and Clara work together? Not together, she replied. Clara acted alone, driven by fear of losing her share, but Thornton's attempt set the stage. Well, when Clara found the office already disturbed, she seized her chance. The ransom note, orchestrated through poor Mr. Ellis, was her attempt to shift blame, perhaps to Gerald. Peter Ellis, who had been silent, nodded vigorously. That sits true. Gerald pressured me, but Clara, she knew about the note. She told me to keep quiet, said it would protect us all. Clara, now back in the room, under Higgins' watch, glared at Peter, but said nothing. Thornton, however, took a step toward the door, only to find Higgins blocking his path. Stay where you are, Mr. Thornton, Higgins said gruffly. We still be checking your lodgings for that broken watch, and the alley for more evidence. Miss Marple Sid's eyes twinkled. You still find the file with Clara Constable, but Mr. Thornton Sid's attempt explains the glass and the thread. He was the shadow in the alley, arguing with Gerald, not about the file, but about money, as Gerald thought Thornton might pay for information. Gerald Sip's mouth dropped open. You mean he approached me? That night at the Blue Boar, he offered me cash for details about the will. I thought he was just a nosy cousin. Thornton Sit's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I only wanted what was mine, he muttered. My mother suffered for that secret. I thought the file would prove my claim. Miss Marple's expression softened, but only slightly. Greed and justice often wear the same face, Mr. Thornton, but breaking into offices and stirring up trouble, that's sex no way to right a wrong. Higgins clapped a hand on Thornton Sit's shoulder. You still coming with me too? We still sort this out at the station. As the room emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her mind still turning. The twist had caught them all off guard, two culprits, each acting alone, their motives intertwined, yet separate. Clara's theft had succeeded, but Thornton's failed attempt had left the trail of clues that led her to the truth. The file would be recovered, the Winthrop secrets laid bare, and justice, in its quiet village way, would be served. Chapter 15. Resolution and Reflection. The morning sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, as if the village itself were exhaling after the tumult of the past days. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting needles clicking softly, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her. The Winthrop file had been recovered from beneath Clara's floorboards, just as she had confessed, and both Clara Winthrop and James Thornton were now in custody, their motives laid bare like cards on a table. The file's contents, Miss Winthrop's will, and the scandalous letters from 1912, were safely back with Mr. Hargreaves, who had promised to handle the estate with utmost care, ensuring the rightful heirs, including Thornton, received their due under the law. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered as she knitted, her mind sifting through the case's intricacies one last time. Clara's desperation to protect her inheritance and the family name had driven her to theft, while Thornton's quest for justice, twisted by years of resentment, had led him to attempt the same crime. Poor Peter Ellis, caught in Gerald's schemes, had been a reluctant pawn, his ransom note a clumsy diversion. Gerald himself, though guilty of manipulation, had not touched the file, a small mercy given his debts. The slivers of glass from Thornton's broken watch crystal, the grey thread from his coat, the scratched lock, and Clara's muddy shoes had all pointed to the truth, like signposts in a fog. She sipped her tea, reflecting on human nature. Greed, pride, fear. These were the threads that wove most crimes, as predictable as the patterns in her knitting, yet each case was unique, a new stitch in the fabric of her experience. She thought of Clara, whose devotion to her aunt had curdled into resentment, and Thornton, whose rightful claim had been tainted by his reckless actions. Even Gerald, with his charming facade, was a victim of his own weaknesses. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. It was Dr. Haydock, his face weary but relieved. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair, "You've done it again. The village is buzzing with your cleverness. How do you do it?" She smiled, setting her knitting aside. "Oh, Doctor, it's simply a matter of listening and watching. People are much the same everywhere. You know, in St. Mary Mead or London, they leave little clues, threads, glass, careless words." Haydock chuckled. "You make it sound so simple. But what about Thornton? Will he get his share after all this?" "I believe so," she said. "The letters confirm his lineage, and Miss Winthrop Sitz will include a provision for him. Justice will be served, though not without cost. Clara will face consequences, but I suspect she'll find peace in time." They chatted a while longer, the doctor marvelling at her knack for unravelling mysteries. As he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifting to the village beyond her window. Mary Mead was quiet again, its secrets tucked back behind lace curtains, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way. Human nature was restless, and where there were people, there were puzzles. She finished her row and set the needles down. Satisfied. The case was closed, the file returned, the truth revealed, yet as always, she felt a quiet sympathy for those caught in their own frailties. She poured another cup of tea, the steam curling like a question mark in the air, and smiled. There would always be another mystery, and she would be ready. And so the mystery of the missing file comes to a close, with Miss Marple's sharp mind bringing light to St. Mary Mead's shadows. What did you think of the final twist? Did you guess the culprits, or did the clues surprise you? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're reading from, your cozy corner of the world or somewhere far-flung. Subscribe to the channel for more tales of intrigue and stay tuned for Miss Marple's next adventure.